Okay, settle in for this one, because what I'm about to tell you started off as the kind of everyday school thing every parent goes through, and quietly turned into something that shifted the way I saw my son's teacher, and more surprisingly, the way I saw myself. Before we dive into it, I'm curious, if we were actually sitting together right now, where would you be listening from? A busy city apartment, a quiet town, maybe somewhere in between. Just picture your own place while I walk you through mine, because this whole story begins in a very ordinary house, on a very ordinary afternoon. It was late autumn, that in-between time when the leaves have already let go of their best colors, and the sky seems a little unsure of itself. The air outside felt used up, like it had been holding its breath all day, and was finally exhaling. The trees in my small front yard had gone from bright yellow to a dull coppery brown, and the daylight was already slipping away. Even though it wasn't that late, I had just gotten home from work, still wearing my dark green cardigan and a pair of flats that had definitely seen better days. I dropped my bag near the hallway table, kicked off my shoes with a sigh, and was just considering whether I had enough energy to start dinner when my phone buzzed on the counter. I reached for it absent-mindedly, expecting some promotion or a reminder or maybe a message from one of the other moms. Instead, I saw, "Hello, Mrs. Bennett, this is Daniel Hayes. I was wondering if I might stop by for a brief talk about Ethan, if you're available this evening." Mr. Hayes, my son's homeroom teacher. The moment I saw his name, my stomach tightened just a little. Not panic exactly, but that low buzz of worry that comes automatically when a teacher wants to talk in person. Ethan's grades weren't awful, but they'd been uneven lately. Really strong one week, then slipping the next. He was smart, creative, but sometimes his attention just drifted away into his own world. I typed back, "Hi, Mr. Hayes. Yes, of course, you're welcome to come by around 6. I put my phone down, but the thought didn't leave me. As I moved around the kitchen, I started seeing everything through someone else's eyes. The half-folded laundry forgotten on a chair, the shoes lined up but not quite straight near the door, the faint scent of vanilla from the candle I'd lit earlier, trying to make the house feel cozier. The clock on the wall ticked just a bit louder than usual, like it was reminding me of every minute left before he arrived. To calm my nerves, I put a small pot of chamomile tea on the stove. There was something comforting about the soft sound of water beginning to warm, the way the steam would soon rise. I straightened a few things that didn't really need straightening, fluffed a pillow and checked the cups twice, even though I already knew they were clean. When the doorbell finally rang, I took a slow breath and went to answer it. There he was, Mr. Hayes, standing on my porch with that calm, organized look he always had at school. He wore charcoal slacks, a navy sweater over a collared shirt, and a light coat left unbuttoned. His glasses were slightly fogged from the chill outside, and there was a touch of pink on his cheeks from the cold. "Good evening, Mrs. Bennett," he said, offering a polite but genuinely warm smile. "Thank you for allowing me to stop by. I hope I'm not imposing." "Not at all," I replied, stepping aside so he could enter. "Come in, please. Can I get you some tea? I just put a pot on." "That would be nice, thank you," he answered, setting his bag carefully near the dining table, the way someone does when they're very aware they're in another person's space. We sat at the table while the tea finished steeping. For the first few minutes, everything was perfectly ordinary, just like you'd expect. We talked about Ethan's assignments, his class participation, the way he sometimes stared out the window lost in thought when he was supposed to be solving math problems. "Ethan is very imaginative," Mr. Hayes said, wrapping his hands around the warm mug after I poured the tea. "He notices things that other students often miss. Little details, the mood in the room, if someone's upset. He takes it all in." There was something gentle in the way he said it, like he wasn't just reporting a fact but recognizing a quality. I smiled a little. "He gets that from his dad," I said without thinking. Then my voice caught up with my reality. "Well, he used to. My husband passed away a few years ago." Mr. Hayes looked up immediately, his expression shifting. "I'm very sorry to hear that," he said quietly. There was no rush to move on, no awkward scramble to change the subject, just a simple, respectful acknowledgement. We sat in a silence that didn't feel empty. The kitchen light spread a warm circle across the table, and the steam from our cups curled up softly between us. The house felt unusually still, as if it had paused with us. "You've done well with Ethan," he said after a moment. He's thoughtful, polite, and resilient. That doesn't just happen. I can tell how much effort you put into being there for him. It shows. Compliments like that always landed strangely with me. When you've spent years just trying to keep everything going, paying the bills, packing the lunches, signing forms, remembering appointments, you start to feel like you're barely keeping your head above water. You don't expect anyone to call that doing well. Thank you, I managed, my voice softer than I meant it to be. Some days it doesn't feel like I'm doing anything particularly right, just not giving up. He gave a small, understanding smile and nodded. I think most people feel that way more often than they admit. We're all carrying more than we show. Something about his tone loosened the knot in my chest a little. This wasn't the standard parent-teacher conversation I'd braced for. This was more human. He talked about how teaching had changed over the 20 years he'd been in the classroom, how students seemed more anxious now, how parents were expected to juggle more roles than ever, provider, counselor, coach, cheerleader, all while handling their own lives. As he spoke, there was a steadiness in him that I found oddly reassuring. Not in a dramatic way, just quiet, steady presence. A gust of wind rattled the window above the sink, and he glanced over toward it. Do you ever feel, he asked slowly, like you turn around and suddenly 10 years have gone by? Like life's been running at full speed while you were just trying to keep up? I let out a breath I hadn't realized I was holding. All the time, I said. It feels like yesterday I was hunting for a daycare that didn't terrify me, and now Ethan is bringing home information about high school prep and career projects. He chuckled softly at that. 1 minute they're drawing on the walls, and the next minute you're asking them to help you reach the top shelf. We both laughed, and the tension in the room finally eased. The conversation began to slide away from grades and school policy and into life itself. Grief, change, what it means to start over, even when starting over just looks like getting up and doing the same routine again. Time slipped by quietly. When he finally glanced at the clock and began to gather his things, 2 hours had gone without either of us noticing. Thank you for the tea, he said, standing and smoothing his sweater. And thank you for the conversation. I appreciate your honesty about everything. And thank you, I replied, walking him toward the front door, for caring about Ethan the way you do. That matters more than I can say. As he stepped out onto the porch light caught the frames of his glasses, tracing a faint glow along the edges. He turned back for just a moment. You know, he said quietly, we often talk about how much we learn from our students, but sometimes it's their parents who teach us the most. I didn't know how to respond to that, not really, so I just nodded. The words followed me long after I locked the door behind him. They stayed with me while I rinsed the cups, while I blew out the candle, while I checked that Ethan was sleeping soundly. Later that night, I returned to the kitchen table and sat in the same chair I'd occupied while he was there. The faint ring of dried tea on the saucer was still visible. The room felt different somehow, though nothing had changed. At the time, I didn't realize it, but that evening was the beginning of a quiet shift, one that would change how I looked at Ethan's teacher, and more importantly, how I understood my own strength. The next morning, the house was unusually calm. Pale sunlight slid around the edges of the curtains, seeping into the kitchen in slow, hesitant beams. I poured myself a mug of coffee and sat by the window, the warmth of the cup spreading into my fingers. It's strange how a normal morning can feel slightly altered, as if your life has been nudged a few inches to the side while you slept. I found my thoughts drifting back to the night before, replaying small details. His careful choice of words, the way he listened without interrupting, the simple statement that I'd done well with Ethan. I realized how rare it was for me to hear that from anyone, let alone someone who saw my son in a setting I didn't. The day went on in its usual pattern. I went to my job at the community center, helped an elderly woman fill out a form, answered questions at the front desk, printed flyers for a charity drive. Each ordinary task passed like beads on a string. But every now and then that one sentence slipped back into my mind. Sometimes it's the parents who teach us the most. I kept wondering what exactly he had meant. When Ethan came home from school that afternoon, backpack slung over one shoulder, I watched him kick off his sneakers in the hallway, humming to himself. How was school? I asked, handing him a glass of water. Good, he said, taking a long drink. Mr. Hayes asked if I could help set up for the science night next week. He said I'm good at organizing and not losing pieces. I smiled at that. That sounds like him, I answered. Are you going to help? Yeah, he said with a little spark of pride. He trusts me with the wires and stuff. The week moved quickly. I saw Mr. Hayes in passing, at pickup, in the hallway, during a brief parent committee meeting. Each time, there was a quiet nod, a small smile, nothing dramatic. But there was a new familiarity there, a soft, unspoken recognition like, I see you, I remember. Then, one Thursday afternoon, my phone rang again. Hello, Mrs. Bennett, it's Daniel Hayes. His voice came through, steady and polite. I hope I'm not calling at a bad time. Not at all, I replied, tucking the phone between my ear and shoulder as I wiped crumbs from the counter. We're putting together a small group of parent volunteers to help with decorations and set up for the science night, he said. I was wondering if you might be willing to help. You have a good sense of calm in a room, and I think that would be useful. I paused only a moment. I'd be happy to, I said. Thank you, he replied, and I could hear the relief in his voice. We're meeting in the gym on Saturday morning. It shouldn't take too long. Saturday arrived crisp and clear, the sky pale and thin with the promise of winter. The school gym smelled slightly of floor polish, old wood, and whatever they used to clean the bleachers. When I walked in, several parents were already there, standing in small clusters by stacks of folding tables and boxes of supplies. Mr. Hayes stood near the center of the gym, a clipboard in hand, sleeves rolled up as he directed people where to go. When he saw me, his expression shifted just slightly, brightening without words. You made it, he said, stepping closer. Of course, I answered, setting my bag down. Just tell me where you need me. He picked up a box filled with navy and gold banners, the school colors, and handed it to me. We're trying to make it look festive, he said, but not like someone's about to jump out of a cake. I laughed, the sound echoing lightly in the big space. So, cheerful but not chaotic. I think I can manage that. We worked steadily, taping streamers, arranging tables, setting up display boards. He moved through the room, checking on everyone, but his path seemed to circle back to where I was more often than chance would explain. He'd hand me a roll of tape, steady the bottom of a ladder while I reached for a corner, or quietly suggest a better spot for a banner. At one point, after an hour or so, we took a break. We sat side by side on the lower bleacher, each holding a small paper cup of coffee that someone had retrieved from the teacher's lounge. The gym had grown quieter as some of the parents stepped outside to make phone calls or check messages. You seem more at ease today, he said, after a moment of comfortable silence. I glanced at him. More at ease? He nodded slightly. Last time I visited, I could tell you were carrying a lot. I mean, I'm sure you still are, he added softly. But today you look a little lighter. His observation caught me off guard, not in a bad way, just in that way where you suddenly realize someone has truly been paying attention. Maybe I am, I admitted. I've been trying not to let the noise in my head get so loud all the time. It's a work in progress. That's harder than most people realize, he said, turning down the noise. I looked out across the gym. Sunlight slipped in through the high windows, striping the floor with soft, dusty beams. Folding tables stood in neat rows, half decorated and half waiting their turn. Sometimes it helps, I said quietly, to be around people who see something good in you. It reminds you that maybe you're not failing as much as you think. He turned his head slightly, meeting my eyes. You're not failing, he said, and his voice was so gentle and certain that I felt it more than heard it. You're doing more than enough. That's actually part of what I admire about you. For a moment, the sounds in the gym, chairs scraping, someone laughing by the door, the faint hum of the heater, seemed to fade into the background. It wasn't a dramatic movie moment. No music swelled. It was just real, quietly real. Eventually, we stood and went back to work. By late afternoon, most of the other parents had left, carrying away empty boxes and stray decorations. I stayed to help fold a few remaining banners and stack the last of the chairs. Let me give you a hand with those, Mr. Hayes said, stepping over to grab the end of a long banner I was trying to fold neatly. We worked side by side, the rustle of paper and the soft clink of metal table legs filling the space between words. When the last banner was stacked away, we both paused, standing there for a second with nothing left to rearrange. "I'm glad you came today," he said finally. "You made everything feel manageable." There was no hint of flattery in his words, no performance, just sincerity. "Thank you," I replied. "I think I needed this more than I thought I did. It felt good to be useful in a way that wasn't just bills and dishes." We walked out toward the parking lot together. The sky had deepened into a dusky blue, and the air had a sharper bite to it now. Our breaths rose in small clouds as we crossed the pavement. He stopped near his car, hands sliding into his coat pockets. "Drive safely, Mrs. Bennet," he said. Then, after a small pause, "And thank you for everything you do, for Ethan and for the school. It doesn't go unnoticed." There it was again, that quiet, respectful tone that made simple words feel like they carried real weight. I drove home with his voice in my mind and a strange mix of tiredness and energy in my chest. That night, while I was tucking Ethan into bed, he looked up at me with that hopeful expression only kids can pull off. "Mom," he asked, "did Mr. Hayes say anything about my project?" I brushed his hair away from his forehead. "Not yet," I said, smiling, "but I know he's proud of you. He talks about how hard you're working." Ethan's eyes softened. "He's a good teacher," he murmured sleepily. "He listens." I sat on the edge of his bed for a moment after he closed his eyes, feeling those two words sink in. He listens. It was true about Ethan, about me, about anyone in his orbit. That, I realized, was why his presence felt so different. He didn't just talk at people. He heard them. Later that night, after the house had gone quiet, I stood by the living room window looking out at the bare trees silhouetted against the faint glow of the neighborhood streetlights. For the first time in a very long while, the quiet didn't feel heavy or lonely. It felt gentle, like a pause, not an absence. Some part of me understood that this connection, unexpected, calm, steady, was doing something I hadn't known I needed. It was reminding me that I was still more than just someone who got through the day. A few days later, the morning arrived, wrapped in that soft gray light November is known for. The science night was finally here, and the house was alive with Ethan's excitement. He'd been up early, double-checking the labels on his display board, testing the small lights he'd wired into his project. "Do you think Mr. Hayes will like it?" he asked, while we carefully loaded everything into the car. "I think he'll be proud of you no matter what," I answered. "You worked hard, that matters." When we walked into the gym that evening, I almost didn't recognize it. The banners and decorations we'd put up a few days earlier now framed a room full of color and noise and anticipation. Tables lined the room, each covered with experiments, charts, and models. Parents stood in clusters with coffee cups. Students hovered by their projects, talking a mile a minute. Mr. Hayes moved between the tables, clipboard in hand, leaning in to listen to each child with full attention. When he noticed us, he gave a small wave that somehow felt more personal than it should have in a room full of people. "Mrs. Bennet," he said as we approached. Then he turned to my son. "Ethan, I've been looking forward to seeing what you came up with." Ethan straightened his shoulders, suddenly standing a little taller. "It's about renewable energy," he said, pointing proudly to his display. "I built a small model to show how solar panels and wind turbines can work together." Mr. Hayes listened closely, asking thoughtful questions and nodding along. I watched the two of them, teacher and student, and felt a wave of quiet gratitude. Ethan wasn't just a name in a grade book to him. He was a whole person, and Mr. Hayes treated him that way. When Ethan finished his explanation, Mr. Hayes smiled. "This is impressive work," he said. "You have a real talent for understanding how things connect. Keep going with this. You might be designing the systems we all rely on someday." Ethan laughed, a little embarrassed but delighted. "Maybe," he said. "That would be cool." He soon ran off to show his project to a friend, leaving Mr. Hayes and me standing amid the crowd. "You've raised a remarkable boy," he said quietly. "He's bright, but what stands out even more is that he's considerate. He looks out for his classmates. That's not as easy to teach as equations and spelling." "Thank you," I replied, moved by the genuine emotion in his voice. "I've tried my best with him. I can't take all the credit, though. He's had teachers who care." He shook his head gently. "We help shape them, sure, but what they see at home leaves a bigger mark than anything we do in the classroom. Kids like Ethan, They reflect the love they're surrounded by. For a moment, the sounds of the room, cheering, laughter, footsteps, faded into a soft background hum. The words settled in my chest like a warm weight. After a while, he tilted his head toward the doors. "Would you like to step out for a moment?" he asked. "It gets warm in here with so many people." We walked out into the cool evening. The air felt refreshing after the crowded gym. The playground lights glowed softly, casting long shadows from the climbing frames and swings. The trees along the edge of the field were almost entirely bare, their branches tracing delicate lines against the dim sky. "It's strange being here like this," I said slowly. "I used to come to events like these all the time when my husband was still alive. We'd stand at the back together and make fun of how nervous we were for Ethan, when really he was fine. Coming alone felt different at first." He nodded, his expression thoughtful, not pitying. "When you lose someone," he said, "familiar places carry extra layers. They hold the versions of you that existed before. It can make even simple things feel complicated." I glanced at him. "You sound like you speak from experience." He hesitated for a second, then nodded. "I lost my younger sister a few years ago," he said quietly. "We were very close. After that, everything seemed to shift just a little. Not in ways other people could always see, but for me, it changed how I looked at people. I started noticing the effort they put into getting through ordinary days, the quiet strength it takes." "Yes," I said, feeling a familiar ache but also a sense of understanding. "You start paying attention to things you used to overlook, the small acts that keep life going." He turned to look at me fully then, his gaze steady. "That's what I meant the night I visited your home," he said, "when I said parents sometimes teach us the most. You reminded me that strength doesn't always look like big victories. Sometimes it looks like someone getting up every morning, making breakfast, going to work, and loving their child as best they can, even when they're exhausted and hurting." Those words settled deeper than he probably realized. I'd never thought of what I did as anything close to strength. It always just felt like necessity. You do what you have to do. You don't stop to give yourself credit for it. We stood there in silence for a while, the muffled sounds from the gym drifting through the partially open doors, kids chattering, someone calling names over a microphone, the occasional burst of applause. "Mr. Hayes," I said softly, "you've been kind to me in ways you might not realize." He shook his head slightly. "Kindness doesn't cost much," he replied. "But if it's helped, I'm glad." "It has," I said, and I meant it more than he knew. When we walked back inside, the gym felt brighter, though the lights hadn't changed. Ethan later received a special mention ribbon for creativity, which he accepted with a grin so wide it practically split his face. Mr. Hayes shook his hand in front of everyone, looking just as proud as any parent. On the drive home, Ethan talked nonstop about his project, the other displays, his future plans. I listened, smiling, while my thoughts drifted back to the moments outside the gym, the honesty, the shared grief, the quiet recognition of effort. That night, after Ethan was asleep, I did something I hadn't done in years. I pulled out an old notebook from the drawer by my bed and began to write. Not a polished journal entry, just raw words, about being seen, about how connection can show up in places you never expected, about how a simple conversation can make you feel less invisible. It wasn't about romance. It wasn't about longing. It was about presence, about being reminded that I was still allowed to grow, even after so much loss. The weeks that followed unfolded into early winter. The first snow came sooner than usual, soft flakes drifting down like the sky was shaking out a long-forgotten blanket. I stood at the kitchen window that morning, coffee in hand, watching the yard slowly turn white. The world outside seemed hushed, like it was giving everyone permission to slow down. Life settled back into its regular rhythm, work, homework, dinners, bedtime. But under that steady routine, something had shifted inside me. I laughed more easily. I caught myself humming while cooking. I felt less like I was bracing against life and more like I was slowly leaning into it,